So before we start the video, I just want to talk a little bit about this course that I'm creating, which is the CSS 0 to Hero course. So in this video, you're going to be learning a little bit about CSS, but we're not really going to go in depth or cover all of the super advanced features. So if you want to do that, I highly recommend you go and check out this course. Now you can see that we have a bunch of content here. We cover everything in depth. We have quizzes, all sorts of things. And you can just go ahead and do this at your own pace, learn everything about CSS. So this video is kind of a little taster of what you're going to be getting when you take this course. Obviously it's not from the course, but if you do take it, you get a bunch of content. You have all of these different sections, coloring, flexbox, grid, animations, and by the end of it, you will be very, very proficient. You will be able to use CSS in pretty much any scenario. So you can go use it on a website very easily. So go ahead and check out this course if you want to get into learning some really nice and cool features in CSS. All right, let's get started with the video. Hi, welcome to this crash course. So today I'm going to be looking at teaching you the basics of CSS, and I'm going to be trying to do it in one video. So we're going to go over like a bunch of things here. So we're going to go over selectors, colors, fonts. We're not going to go over any of the advanced things, but just enough to, get you off the ground and start working with CSS. So first of all, this is the HTML document I created in a previous crash course. And if you don't know HTML, I highly recommend you go take a look at that, because you're going to need to know how to use HTML in order to use CSS. So there's a link in the description to the previous crash course for HTML. So if you don't know that, you can go and check it out. So let's get started. So firstly, I want to talk about what CSS actually is. So this is the website we have here in Chrome. It's opened up. It has all of the formatting and sizing and text. But right now it's looking quite bland. It doesn't look very good. And if you look at pretty much any other website today, so for example, Google Fonts over here, we're actually going to be using that later in the lecture. It looks a lot better. And pretty much any website you go to now is going to use CSS in some way. So it's pretty important and that we use CSS, because without it, our website won't look very good. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to do is create a CSS file. So I have Sublime Text open right here. I'm going to go ahead and do Control-N to create a new file, and I'm going to use Control-S to save it. Now I'm going to go and create a new folder for my crash course here. I'm just going to call it CSS. And in here, I'm going to save it as style.css. This is similar to how the standard name for an HTML document is index. The standard name for a CSS document is style. So we're going to go ahead and save that. Now it is in a different folder. Remember that. If we go ahead and check this out, it's not in our HTML folder. So I'm going to be showing you how to reference that in just a second. So we have our CSS document created, but we don't actually have it connected yet because it's in a completely separate file. We're going to need to connect the two, okay? So what we're going to do is use something called a link tag. So in the head portion of your website, you're going to go ahead and create a link tag. I did that by typing link and hitting tab if you're in Sublime Text. And here, what you're going to do is now reference your style sheet. So I'm not going to really talk about how file directories work, but pretty much what we want to do is go back a folder, because if we actually look at our directory here, the index, the actual HTML file is here, but we have to go back one folder first. So you do that by doing .. okay? And then we want to go into our CSS folder, CSS / and then style.css. So now we've linked to our style sheet. That's pretty easy. But how do we actually know if it's linked properly? Sometimes maybe we've referenced a bad, a non-existent file. So for example, this could be wrong. It's located in a different place. It's been moved somewhere, whatever. Well, the easiest way to test it if you don't have anything in there is just to write some basic property that's pretty visible on the page. So for example, changing the background color. That's what I'm going to do now. Now, don't worry about what I'm doing here. I'm going to talk about all of this in just a second, okay? So once you know CSS, you're going to be able to write these rules on your own, but for now, I'm just going to do it for you so you can see how to test it. And now if we refresh the page, we can see that the background is red. I know it's a little bit hard on the eyes, but for example, let's say we missed one S on the file name. If we refresh now, that style sheet is no longer linked. So that's just one way for you to be able to test your page. So let's go ahead and get rid of this first. The red is quite hard on my eyes. It's probably hard on your eyes too. So we've linked our file. We've created and linked our CSS file. Now let's go ahead and look at the general rule. So pretty much as you saw there, there's a certain way that you have to write CSS code, and it's not like any other programming language where there's, there's data types, there's control flow, conditional, things like that. It's completely different. There's a general rule you have to follow to write CSS, and once you do that, everything becomes easy. So we're going to break down each piece and then talk about it, and then once we're done talking about it, we'll move on to actually working with some of these different properties, okay? So first thing you want to do is it's called the selector, okay? Then you're going to have curly braces, just like that. And then you're going to have a property with a colon followed by a value. And make sure there's a semicolon at the end of everything. Property to value. And this goes on, and you can do it for as many times as you want for one selector. So I'm going to talk about, how to work with selectors in just a second, but for now, pretend that this is a way to select some certain element on a page. Then you have a property and a value. So the property is what decides what style you're changing. So if you want to change the color, the font, the size, even, height and width, there are hundreds of properties out there. And obviously you don't have to memorize every single one of them. You're just going to use the one that you need. And then there's going to be the value. So this is always dependent on the property. So sometimes it could be in pixels, sometimes it can be in a color code. We'll talk about colors in just a second. And sometimes it could be in text, just plain text. So there are many different ways. The value is dependent on the property, okay? So we're going to be going over, all of these properties and values. That's what's the main part of learning CSS, is trying to find out how to use these different properties and values. Okay, so now that you know the general rule, let's go over selectors. So a selector is pretty much a way to select something on a page. So for example, let's say I wanted to select this header. I would use a specific selector to select it, and then I would specify the styles and properties I want for it. So there are so many selectors out there. There are some for selecting something when it's only hovered, or something sub-elements. So I'm only going to be covering the three main selectors that we're going to be using, or that you're probably going to be using when you're building websites, and that's an element selector, a class selector, and an ID selector. So an element selector is just selecting something by the name of the element. So for example, let's say I wanted to select this paragraph here, okay? And for example, let's just say I wanted to change the color. So like I said, I'm going to talk about color later, but to select this, I would first find what element this is. So this is a P tag right here, okay? So what I'm going to do is just type the element name, P, just like that, okay? Then I'm going to, just as followed in the general rule, open up those curly braces, and then type out my properties and values. So now when I go ahead and refresh, you can see that this is red, but this is also red. So what's going on here? Whoops. Pretty much what's happening is this selector works so that it finds every single element of this element name or tag name on a page, and then uses this to find the properties and colors. Whoops. So for example, on this page, we have 2 paragraph tags. So the style is going to style every single paragraph on the page. But what if we want to just select this one? So this is where our class and ID comes in, okay? Let's go ahead and use it now. So before we actually use it in our CSS, we're actually going to need to define the class, or set the class somewhere. And you do this using attributes. So there are HTML attributes all over the place. There's one here in the link tag, and they're pretty much just giving some extra information about the tag. So in order to define an attribute, go into the opening tag of any of the element you want to give the class to, and just type class, equal to, and then you open up with some speech marks or whatever you want to call them. So here you're going to specify the class name. Now this can be whatever you want, but I would try to use something short and also memorable, talking about what the element does. So let's just say opening statement. I know it's not very short, but this is something that is pretty memorable. So this would be all the opening statements you would give this class to, okay? So now what we're gonna do is go and actually reference it in the style sheet. So you can't just type opening statement like that, because the CSS or the compiler or the browser is going to think that it's going to look for all elements with this tag, and obviously this isn't a real tag. So in order to specify it as a class, you have to put a dot before it, just like that. So anytime the compiler sees a dot, it's going to say, okay, we are going to look for everything with this class and style it, okay? Let's go ahead and open the brackets, and we're going to give it that same property. Now if we refresh the page, we can see that we have our styles, and it's only applied to this paragraph, because again, it's looking for all elements of this class opening statement. So now let's talk about IDs. They're very similar, but there's a subtle difference and convention that most people follow, and I'll explain that in just a second. But the ID is almost exactly the same. Let's say I wanted to change this from a class to an ID. All I would do is just change the attribute to ID, and then in our style sheet, all IDs are referenced with a hash, okay, or an octothorpe. So you would put that symbol before, and this would reference it as an ID. So now when I go ahead and refresh it, you can see nothing changes because this is an ID and we're referencing an ID over here. So before it was saying look for all classes of that type, but now it's saying look for all IDs of that type. But what's the difference? Well, usually most developers would use classes for things you want to use multiple times. So for example, if you had a diary or a management planner app, you would give every task or box with a task in it a class of task. So then each task could be styled given some size, some maybe movement, and all sorts of things like that. But IDs, on the other hand, you should only use them once. You can use them more than once. There's nothing stopping that, but usually the convention is that IDs should be only used once and for one element at a time. So that's just the major difference. So for example, our opening statement would probably be an ID because there's only going to be one opening statement for our page. But if we had something like, if we wanted to style out each paragraph in our own way, maybe give it a different font, change some of the font sizes, things like that, we would have to create a class and most likely call it paragraph text. And then for everything with paragraph text, we would add that class and it would style in our CSS sheet. So that's just a minor difference. There's also a lot of internal differences between IDs and classes. It's called specificity. I'm not actually going to go over it in this video. It's a little bit complicated. But just know that there are some differences between classes and IDs, and you should not use them in the same way. Alright, so now that we know what selectors are and how to use them, why don't we go ahead and start looking at some of the properties that we can use in CSS. So this is the fun part. So the first one that you've already seen is color. So first thing I want to do is go ahead and add that ID. I'm going to go ahead and add an ID of opening statement to it, just like that. And now I'm going to go ahead and select it using my ID selector, which is a hash, opening dash statement. Make sure to add the curly braces. And now we're going to add our properties. So the one you've already seen before is obviously red, which is, this is one type of color, okay? So there are actually 3 different ways to add color to any text or to an element. So the first one is using the text name. So we've already seen this before, but it's not just red. There's also there's many different colors. You can search through all of the CSS colors on your own. There's blue, and there's all the primary colors, but then you have things like steel blue, or some colors that you wouldn't normally find in a primary palette. So there's a lot of colors there, but it's not specific enough. Even with all the colors there are, what if you want something very, very specific? So that's where the other 2 types come in, and they're called Hex Code and RGB, or RGB color. So I have a color picker open here. If you just go ahead and search Google, you can see it'll give you a color picker here. So if you've ever used something like Photoshop or Microsoft Paint, you have this thing called a color picker, right? And usually you can select it with a dropper or other things. But there's this hex code up here. There's this hashtag and then 6 characters. So you've probably been wondering what that is if you don't already know, and that is what we call hex code. So I'm not going to go over how hex code is structured. Just know that each character has 16 possible combinations instead of 10. So usually our normal system is 0 to 9, but in hex code or hexadecimal, we have 0 to 9 and then A to F. Okay, so then there's 6 characters, and each pair of characters specifies the amount of green, red, green, and blue in the color. So for example, 00 would be the lowest of a color, and FF would be the highest. So there are so many different combinations you can make with hex code, and luckily we have these really neat color pickers given to us which actually just do all the work for us. So you can just go through, and if you want to find a very specific color that you wouldn't find in text, you could just copy that. Okay, so you can go ahead and do that, and you can just paste it in like normal. Just like we typed in the text, you can type in hex code. All right, let's go ahead and refresh our page and see how our color looks. And you can see it's that olive green that's on the color picker. So there are, like I said, there are many different hex codes that you can use. You can define really intricate color palettes with this. And just using hex code over text makes your website look a lot more professional. So there's also another form of color code, which is called RGB. So it's very similar in that it allows you to create all of these different color combinations, but it's structured in a different way, okay? So I'm just going to go ahead and get that same olive green color back. So you can see it's structured RGB, and then it has 3 numbers, okay? So RGB works in a way that each value can go from 0 to 255. And each number represents a certain amount of primary color in the final color. So the first number would be the amount of red, the second would be the amount of green, and the third would be the amount of blue, okay? So based on, you know, how much you change and how much you put, it's actually going to change and make a color. So for example, if I wanted to create a pure white, I would go all the way to the bottom, and you can see that right here in our hex code, we have 00, which means no red, no green, because that's the next 2, and no blue. And here we have 0 red, 0 green, and 0 blue. They're exactly the same, and depending on what your preference is, they're going to give the exact same color, whether you use hex code or RGB values. Now, you might be asking, what is the difference? You know, what's so beneficial about using RGB code, RGB color codes over hex codes? Well, there's actually a lot of benefits to using RGB codes. Now, right now, when we're just using CSS and HTML, it doesn't really matter which one we're using, but working with hexadecimal, especially in programming, is quite difficult if you don't know how to use it properly. Usually we're used to using base 10, which is 0 through 9, our normal numbers numerical system. And that's what makes RGB so much better, is because it's split up into 3 different categories, and each one has a number or a value from 0 to 255, whereas hex code are pairs, and then it has, you know, each one has a certain number of combinations, and it gets really complicated really fast. So it's much better to use this, because let's say you wanted to create a random number generator. Imagine how complicated a hexadecimal number generator would be. You'd have to go and, you know, create some number, find the number of possible combinations, and then search through a list. It's a lot of work. Whereas RGB, all you'd have to do is generate 3 random numbers between 0 and 255. It's really easy to use RGB colors over hex colors. So that's just a little difference. It doesn't really matter which one we use at this stage, but once you get into things like very intricate applications where you need to do changing colors, maybe even random colors, it's much easier to work with RGB over hex code. So those are the different types of colors. I would recommend you use a color picker to do all of your, make all of your colors. If you want to use a more detailed color palette. If you want to go ahead with text colors, go ahead. There's nothing wrong with it, but I prefer to use my own color codes because then I can, be really specific with what I want. I'm just going to go ahead and cover a really cool feature here. It's called alpha. So all you have to do is add an A to the end of this. And at the end, we can add a fourth value, which is called alpha. So this is pretty much going to specify the transparency. Now this isn't between 0 and 255. This is between 0 and 1. So let's say I put 0.2 here, okay? When I refresh the page, you can see this is very dim and almost invisible. If we put 0 here, this is going to be completely transparent. Whereas if this was something like 1, which is the maximum, this would be completely visible. So that's just a little tip if you're looking to create some transparency in your color. Alright, so that's pretty much all of the different types of text colors. But what if we wanted to specify background color? So it's actually very easy to do this. All you have to do is change the property from color to background. Now you could use background dash color, but I wouldn't recommend that because using this you have more options. You can specify your background to be an image or some gradient or a repeating pattern. There's a lot of different things you can use with this specific property. If we go ahead and refresh this, we can see that the background of this element is green, and it's not really what you'd expect. You'd expect maybe it's colored in each letter green, but that would take up an enormous amount of processing power. So there's just this invisible box around each element. We'll talk about that in later in this crash course because it's very important to understanding how CSS works. Okay, so that's how to change background. Now let's move on to fonts. So fonts is probably my favorite part of CSS because when I was learning it, when I first picked up how to use fonts, it completely changed how I was making websites. You can see that the standard serif font that HTML uses, that the browser uses, it's quite boring and bold, and it doesn't look very good, okay? So I'm actually going to go ahead and erase this right here because we don't need it. And by the way, you can leave empty selectors open and it won't actually affect your page, just as we are seeing here. So the first property we're going to be learning about is font size, okay? So when you specify H1, H2, H3 and paragraph tags, they're all given a defined size by HTML. That's the way it is. But what if you want to change the size? If you're making a full page slider, some H1 text here is not going to have the right size for you. So there's actually a very easy property to do this, and pretty much all font properties start in the same way. You type font dash, and then you have a bunch of different font properties here. Now you can search through these on your own, but the one we're looking for is size. Okay. Now for now we're going to be learning about one type of value, which is called pixels. Okay. So the computer or the browser compiles and looks at the amount of pixel size it is. It doesn't look by millimeters or centimeters. Although there's many different units out there that you can use, we're going to be using pixels as the standard. So I'm going to set my font size to around 30. And you can't just type 30 like this. You have to type PX after it, okay? And then, of course, end it with the semicolon. So if we go ahead and refresh the page, you can see that this is much larger now. And it's actually bigger, or almost as big as the H1 text. So now that we know about font size, why don't we go ahead and actually start defining our page? Because right now, we're just playing around with some of these features. So I'm going to go ahead and add a couple classes and IDs to this. So I'm going to keep the opening statement to the same. And I'm going to go ahead and add a class to the H1 of title, okay? Because let's just say I had multiple websites on here, maybe it was a news website, I want to be able to reuse that title class on multiple pages. So we're also going to go ahead and add a subtitle class, just like that. And now I'm going to go ahead and add a class of paragraph to both paragraphs, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and add that class. And you can add an ID and a class both times on the paragraph, but I was talking about specificity before. Just know that the ID is going to overrule any properties and values that may have been specified in the class. So for example, if the font size in the class was 20 pixels, and the ID was 15 pixels, then the ID would prevail. The font size would be 15 pixels. So just keep that in mind if you're adding both of them. All right, so now that we've added our classes, let's go ahead and start specifying them, okay? First thing I want to do is go ahead and specify the title class. So we're going to go dot title and open that up. Now I'm going to specify the subtitle class, which is dot subtitle, and now I'm going to specify the paragraph, just like that. And also at the top, I'm going to specify the body. So this is going to be the whole page. Maybe we want to change the background color eventually. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and start working with this, okay? So first thing I want to do is change the font size of this, the main article, the title. So I'm going to say font size, make sure to add the colon, and then we're going to say, let's just say for now 40 pixels, okay? So you can see that is a lot bigger now. For the subtitle, I want to make it a little bit bigger because it's quite small. It's just a little bit bigger than the text. So I'm going to make this 25 pixels, okay? Let's go ahead and refresh the page, and I think that's looking a lot better. Okay, so now we've changed the font sizes of those, and I think we're just going to keep this the same. So we're not going to change anything here. Well, the paragraph size, let's just go ahead and remove that formatting that we did in the previous videos. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the I tag, and I'm also going to remove the bolding tag and the underline tag, just like that. So we're going to work with this from the ground up. We don't want any HTML formatting, because if you know CSS, then the HTML formatting becomes, it doesn't look very good. So we're going to go ahead and refresh, and now all of that formatting is gone. So let's go ahead and work on some of our next features, which are font weight and font family. So first let's cover font weight. So if you don't know what font weight is, it's pretty much just bolding. Think of it as bolding text, except when you weight it, you have different options of how much you want to bold it. So if you're working with a normal text editor, Microsoft Word, Google Docs, you have one type of bold property. You bold it once, that's it. But when you're working with web development and you're working with CSS, you actually have multiple types of bolding. So you can specify how bolded you want something to be based on its weight. So the way to, weight something is go ahead and say font-weight, pretty easy. Now here, you have to specify a value from 0 to 800. 0, obviously, nothing's going to happen. And then 100 is the absolute lightest option. And then 800 is the highest value. So 400 is considered the normal amount. So a paragraph tag like this would have a font weight of 400. Let's just, for trial here, go ahead and set our font weight of our title to 800. You don't have to put pixels here because this is an arbitrary value. So this isn't, some pixels or centimeters, anything like that. If we refresh, you can see nothing happens because the H1 already sets something like this to 800. But if we go ahead and look at something like the paragraph, so we're going to just cut that out of there. If we go ahead and look at the paragraph and set the font weight to 800, you can see that this is ultra bolded. So this is pretty much the same bolding as the headers. So that's just how you use font weight. Let's just say, for example, we wanted to actually make the title normal bolding. I would set the font weight to 400, okay? Now I refresh this, and this looks just like this just looks like the paragraph text, but much bigger. So that's how to work with font weights. Now let's move on to font families, okay? So when you think of font families, just think of the type of font. It's not really complicated to understand or anything. It's just that's the way that web designers and web developers talk about it, because there's different groups of fonts. So if you have taken anything related to design, there's serif and sans serif fonts. So just think of it in that way, okay? So there are so many different fonts out there, but in order to use them, you have to actually link to them in your documents, okay? So because the fonts aren't going to be downloaded apart from a few on your computer locally, just automatically. You're going to need to actually include them. So I have a really good website that you can use to find fonts. It's called Google Font. So any fonts that you want to use or find that aren't included on your machine, they're all found on Google Fonts or other font websites like it. So you can go through and browse and see, you know, what's there. So my personal favorite font is called Montserrat. So if you want to view a font or something like that, what you can do is just click on it, and it's going to bring you to the font page. You can see very specifically what the font actually looks like. And if you like the font, all you have to do is click select this font, okay? And you can actually select multiple fonts at once if you want to, you know, swoop them all in one go and include them in your document. So let's say I'm going to add Roboto as well, just for titles. So I'm going to use one font for titles and one font for paragraphs. So now when we open this up, you can see we have a bunch of different things here. Okay, so we have this link tag, which we're going to end up including in our HTML document in order to use the font. But for now, we can't actually use it in different bolded. So if we actually look at this, you can see it says here family Montserrat, and then that symbol there, Roboto. So we can only use it in one font, which is the regular. But we can actually include different fonts if we wanted to. So let's just say I wanted to go ahead and look at some lighter fonts. So for example, 300. And I wanted to include also for this one, light 300. But for the title, I wanted to go ahead and look at a bolded font. So sorry, I said 800. It actually goes up to 900. But the usual limit that most designers stop out is actually 800, because it just looks, once you get above 800, it looks quite unusual. So you can go ahead and select whichever ones you want. So I have light and regular for our paragraph font, but for our title, I'm going to go ahead and include a bold 700, just like that. So now if we go back to our embed, you can see some things have been changed in our link here. And this is pretty much going to tell Google when the document is being compiled that, hey, I want to get this font in these weights, okay? So that's pretty much what's going here. So all you have to do is copy this link once you've selected all of your fonts and weights, and in your HTML document, you can paste it in the head section of your document, okay? So there we go, just paste it in there. And one thing to note, always paste your style sheet below everything else. So in this case, we're going to paste it just below our fonts here. But in a normal situation with a big application, if you're including any libraries or icon sets, things like that, you're always going to want to post your style sheet next at the last, because what's going to happen is this is going to go straight in order. So it's going to look at our Google fonts here, and then it's going to look at our style sheet. If we're referring to a font that hasn't even been loaded in yet, it's going to throw back some unusual things. So just make sure that you have that in order. But once you have everything specified, we can actually go ahead and use them in our style sheet. So you can see here we have something called specifying CSS. So if you don't know how to use it, there's some instructions here, but we're actually just going to go ahead and do this ourselves. So for our title, we're going to use Roboto, and we're also going to use it for our subtitle. So I'm going to go font -family. And I'm just going to set it to Roboto. Make sure it's in speech marks, just like that. Or quotation marks, whatever you want to call them. So, Roboto, not robot. So once you specified the font family, you don't actually need to go and say if it's sans serif or serif. That's not necessary. So you can just type the font name and be done with it. I'm also going to copy this property and put it in the subtitle section, just like that. And for our paragraph, I'm going to specify Montserrat. So I'm going to type font-family, make sure to add the colon, and our quotation marks, Montserrat. Now make sure to get the font name right, because if you don't get it right, it's not going to reference the right font, okay? So there we go, that's done. Now let's go ahead and refresh our page and see how that looks. And there we go, you can see it's changed a lot. Just by changing the font, everything looks different. So you can see the power of actually changing your font and what it looks like. Okay, so we've changed our fonts now, and we've worked a lot with text so far. We've done colors, backgrounds, and now we've done fonts. But what if we want to work with actual pieces of information. So let's say we wanted to work with changing the width of something or moving it around the page, and that's what we're going to be looking at in the next part of this crash course. So now that we've done text, we're going to be moving on to layout and display. So the first thing I want to do here is go ahead and just include something that we can work with. So in this case, I want to be using an image from the internet. I'm just going to be saving it and referencing it in my CSS file. And I'm also going to show you how to do that. And then we can start working with some of these layout properties. So I'm just going to go ahead and search stock photo, just like that. Oops, can't spell today. So I'm going to go ahead and look for just a random stock photo here. There's a lot of different things here. You can use a landscape picture. I think that would be better. So I'm going to go ahead and look for landscape photo, just like that. And from here I can find anything I want. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this picture. Just make sure you want to make sure the picture resolution isn't too large, because this is basically saying take up 2000 pixels of space wide. And we already know from this one that this is 30 pixels, so you can already imagine what 2000 pixels is going to look like. So I'm going to take something relatively smaller. There's a lot of pictures here. Most of these are quite high resolution. I think this is good. This is a 720p picture. So I'm going to go ahead and save this image here. Let's go ahead and look for my folder. I'm going to go ahead and save it here. And I'm just going to call it image. Okay. There we go. So now I want to actually include this into my website. So I'm going to go over to my HTML file, and under here, I'm just going to do it actually under the main article title. I'm going to go ahead and create an image tag, so img, and now it's going to say source. So what I'm going to say is // because remember it's in our CSS folder, css/image.jpg. Okay. So now we've created that image. Let's see how it looks like here. You can see it is quite wide for our page. We're going to be specifying that in just a second, but the important part is our image is included. All right, let's go ahead and start working with some of these properties. So first thing I'm going to do is actually give this a class of image, just like that. I'm just going to say article image to give it some authentic feel. Now I'm going to go ahead and reference it in my CSS document. So I'm going to say dot, remember that's the class specifier, article, image, okay, the curly braces. So the first two properties we're going to learn now are height and width. So these can be specified in any unit you want. You can use pixels, you can use centimeters, millimeters. There are so many different units out there, but the one we're going to be using is percent, and I'm going to be talking about that right now. So I'm going to first specify the width to 100%, and I'll show you what that means in just a second. Let's refresh the page. You can see that first of all, that sliding bar is gone. So what's going on here? Imagine this, what the browser does is look at this percentage value. It's going to calculate the width of the browser and then say, okay, this picture has to be 100% of that length. So you can see no matter how we resize it here, it's always going to stay the same. No matter what we do, how we change it, how we resize it, it's always going to stay the same width, and it's going to adjust accordingly. So that's what the percentage value does. If we set this to 50%, for example, and refresh, it's going to take up only half of the page. So I'm going to move it around, and you can see no matter what I do, it only takes up half. Okay, so there we go. We've specified the width. You can do the exact same thing with the height. Although for the height, I wouldn't recommend using percentage because it's a little bit hard to manage. Instead, for the height, I'm just going to put it above the width actually. We're going to use a pixel value. So I'm just going to say 300 pixels, for example. And you can see that it looks a little bit stretched out. So you can mess around with this image however you want. For now, I'm just going to say 250 pixels just to even things out a little bit. Maybe 275. Doesn't really matter what you do. You can mess around with the height how you like it. So the next thing I want to do is talk about display modes or display properties. So everything on this page right now has a certain display property set. Now, there are so many display properties out there, but I'm going to be talking about the three main ones. Actually, well, two, and one of them is just kind of a neat little trick. So the first two are block and inline. So if you watched my HTML crash course, or you know how to use HTML, you'll know that there are something called block level elements, which take up their own space, and inline elements, which are kind of within other blocks. They don't have to take up their own space. They can be placed anywhere, and they will sort of go with the flow. So we can actually set the display type of these different elements. So we can specify whether we want them to be block level or inline. So let's say for this image, I wanted it to be inline. I'm going to use the display property, and now I can either say block or inline. So I'm going to say inline for now. We refresh the page. You can see obviously it doesn't move because our page is laid out in a way that doesn't allow it to move like that. But if we wanted to, let's just say, use a, maybe an inline tag or a span tag, I think that's a better use. If you don't know what a span tag is, don't worry. Just know it's like an inline tag for grouping content together. So I'm going to create a span tag here, and I'm just going to move this little piece of text in here. So because we only have one span tag, I'm just going to use the element selector. So I'm going to go here really quickly and create a span tag. So span. And now I'm going to set the display to block. Okay. Now we go ahead and refresh the page, and you can see that that little piece of text that we surrounded is actually put on its own space. It's moved onto its own line. It completely disregards everything. So we can see how this works. And if we set this back to inline, obviously nothing is going to change. Because again, span by its nature is an inline element. That's its function. It's supposed to be inline. So you can see kind of how this works. And it didn't work with our image, obviously, because an image, it just doesn't work with an image right now, or based on the flow and style of our page. But for things like spans, which are inherently inline in their nature, changing it to block can really change the way a page looks. So there's also a third feature which is used very commonly in a lot of interactive applications to hide things. Maybe if you want to have a collapse feature, and it's none. So we can actually set the display of something to none, and this is pretty much just going to hide that element. So you can't see it on the page. It completely removes it. It doesn't, make it invisible. It doesn't remove the color or anything. It just completely removes it from the page. But it's not actually removed. If I go ahead and open up the Chrome inspector, it's still there. It's still there. You can see that when we hover over it, that actual HTML element is still there. It's just the display is set to none. So if we change this back to block, like that, you can see how it's changed. So you can see that it's there. It's still there. It's just that the display is changed to none. All right, so those are the three types of displays. Now we're going to move on to the last part of this crash course. It's a little bit difficult to grasp at first, but once you get it, it really changes the way you use CSS. So it's called the box model, okay? So I'm going to go here and search up CSS box model. And now you can see this is where that theory about everything is surrounded by a box comes in. So when you're looking at this website, just imagine that everything on this page is surrounded by, or it's contained in some sort of box, okay? So this box is going to contain that content, whether it's a title, an image, a text, maybe a link, it doesn't matter. It's always going to be in that box. But then inside that box, there's actually, there's more, okay? So the content is going to be where your content is located. So that's going to be your text, your image, things like that. Then you have something called the padding, okay? So the padding is going to be spacing around the text. This is going to be, sorry, not the text, the content. This is going to be relative. So if you want to, not the content itself, but if you want to sort of separate it from the border, give it some internal space, then that's what you would do. So for example, if I had that invisible box here, I'm actually going to go ahead and make it a little bit more visible. For the title, I'm going to add a background, of blue, just for now. So you can see that box clearly here. You can see that it extends all the way through the page, and that's what we're doing. We're basically, when we're setting the background to blue, we're saying, okay, the background of the content right here should be blue. So then we have our padding, obviously, which is going to create some space between the content and the border. And we can't actually see the border now, so I'm going to add one. I'm not going to cover the border pixel in this, sorry, the border property in this video. But you can see, actually, it's a little bit faint. Let's go ahead and make it something like 5 pixels. So you can see that we have the content and then the border. Now, I'm just going to do this very briefly. Don't worry, I'm going to cover it in just a second. I'm going to add some padding here, okay? So I'm going to add 10 pixels. And now you can see there's some space between the content and the border, okay? So we have that border and property and everything like that. But then our final one is the margin. So this is the big game changer, and this is the one that's probably very commonly used to move elements around on the page. And what the margin is pretty much moving everything together. So this is going to be moving the content, the border, everything. It's going to be shifting it, and it's not going to be relative spacing. So if I add a 10 pixel margin, like I said, I'll cover this in just a second. If I go ahead and do that, you can see the spacing of the entire box has changed. Okay, so that's how you use the box model. That's what the general theory is, okay? So how do we actually use it? How do we move things around and shape them? So you already saw one way of doing it there. It's with the padding and margin properties, okay? So I can say padding, and then what I do is specify a pixel value. It can also be a percentage. It doesn't just have to be pixels. But what this does is add padding completely around. So this is going to be on the left, the right, and up and down. So you can see when I do that, it adds padding all around. But what if I wanted to do it just on one side? So what if I wanted to, for example, just move this, just add a little bit of padding on the left? Well, you pretty much saw it there. All I have to do is type padding, and then you have dash, left, top, right, bottom. So instead of being left, right, up, down, it's left, right, top, bottom. So just keep that in mind. But in this case, we want left padding, which is going to be the padding on this side. And I'm going to add 10 pixels. Now, if I refresh the page, you can see the top and the bottom and the right, they're completely normal. There's no padding. But on the left, there's a little bit of spacing. I know it's not noticeable, but if I make it a little bit more obvious, something like 100 pixels, you can see how that affects the page. So that's how to do padding. Now, what if we wanted to do margin? Well, margin is pretty much exactly the same, except the property is different. So we can say margin, and this is going to be, let's just say for now, again, 50 pixels, just to make it a little bit more obvious. So you can see just like that. It adds top, bottom, left, and right margin. You can see it doesn't create space between the border and the content. It creates space between the actual content and the padding and the rest of the page. So we can also do this specifically on the left. So if I wanted to just create left padding, I would do margin dash left. And you can see that the top, bottom, and right are exactly the same, but then the left has 50 pixels of padding. Margin. So that's pretty much it for the box model. There's also different ways to specify this, but I'm not going to go over them because they're a little bit complex. And I just don't want to create that confusion right now. This works perfectly fine, and you don't need to worry about anything else. But for now, this is pretty much all the basics of CSS. So I'm just going to actually remove this margin left padding. I don't really need it. Just like that. So now we have the main article, our background, our border, things like that. I'm going to go ahead and remove those as well. So now that we learned about the box model, why don't we go ahead and actually put this into action just very quickly. Not to scare you or anything, just to give it some content on the page. So what I'm going to do is just remove this body tag first, since we don't need it. And first thing I want to do is give the title some top and bottom margin. So I'm going to go ahead and give it some margin top. Because again, I don't want to actually space this box out. We don't really need to. I want to move this away from the rest of the page. So I'm not going to give it some top margin because that'll make it look weird. I'm just going to give it some bottom margin. So this space here, I want to expand it. So I'm going to give it about 50 pixels of bottom margin, and you can see everything has been moved down. So now let's go ahead and move this subtitle down as well. So I'm going to go ahead and add some bottom margin to the subtitle, because I want to space out the text from the subtitle. So this isn't going to be very severe. I'm just going to do around 10 pixels. There we go. Now I refresh the page. It's not very visible. It must have been too small of a difference. Let's go ahead with 20. And now you can see there's a little bit of spacing. I also want to move the actual subtitle down. So what I'm going to do is add some top margin. Now this isn't the best way to do it. With CSS Grid and Flexbox, this isn't really commonly done anymore. It's quite a hacky solution, but I'm just going to go ahead and do it anyways to show you how it looks. So I'm going to go margin dash top, and I'm going to give it another 20 pixels. So now you can see, oh, that actually made it shorter. Let's go ahead and make 40 pixels. So you can see that instead of overlapping with all the other content, it actually pushes it down. So this is what I was saying about the box model. All of the boxes are pretty much touching each other, and when you add margin, you're shifting the boxes so that everything is pushed down. So you're actually changing the shape of these boxes. And that's what makes the box model so powerful, is you don't have to, for example, if I wanted to push this down just by 10 pixels, you don't have to push this by 10 pixels and then this like a chain reaction, because it does everything for you. You make this a little bit bigger and it just pushes everything down along with it. So that's the real power of the box model, and that's why a lot of websites use it so commonly. It's kind of the standard of shaping your website, at least in the finer details, and making it look how you want to make it look. So that's pretty much everything there is to CSS, at least for the very basics. There's so much more. There's transitions, animations, there's different layout systems, but for now, these are all of the basics that you need to get off the ground and start using CSS. So I'm actually just going to show you the difference right here between our page without CSS and with CSS. So I'm going to go ahead and just corrupt this link to our style sheet. I'm going to remove one S, and you can see how different it looks without all the CSS. So it's very important to any website to use it. Without it, your website is really not going to take off the way you expect it to. And this is kind of the standard to styling your website. There's almost no other way to do it. Using on your front end, there's no other way to style it on your front end. This is kind of the standard, and it's essential to anyone looking to do any web development. So first you learn HTML, and then this is what you learn next, which is your CSS. All right, so that's pretty much it for the basics of CSS. Now we're going to be moving on to the next part in this crash course kind of series, which is JavaScript. So that's kind of the third part, or the third major part of front-end web development.